The Sunken Temple raid has now been out for roughly a month and you want to improve your DPS. You're trying your best, you're following guides, but you just can't quite seem to improve your DPS or passes. Well, hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be equipped with all the tricks you need for each boss to increase your DPS within the raid. Now, don't worry, you can still pass very high and do very good DPS despite being in a casual guild or raid pug. I've been in only casual to semi-hardcore guilds since 2019 Classic and still managed to achieve those lustrous 99s consistently. Though I will note it will be considerably easier to do that if you are in a much more organised raid setting. Now, before we get onto the tricks for each boss individually, we first need to talk about consumes and raid buffs / debuffs. WoW Classic is all about buffs and debuffs. Season of Discovery is no exception. If your raid doesn't supply you with the correct buffs, and doesn't also have the correct boss debuffs, you will sadly just lose out on DPS. WoW Classic is much more about preparation and knowledge than it is about dealing with 100 boss / raid mechanics all at once. You should aim to bring all of your class damaging consumables. I won't go into detail on which class needs what consumable as the video will be going on for too long, but you can easily search up what consumables your class should use to increase its DPS, and if you are a Retribution Paladin, I have a DPS PvE guide on my channel. You can have a look at that, it goes into all the detail on what consumables you should need. Alongside this, you should always try to bring the 3 world buffs, which consist of Songflower for 5% crit and plus 15 to all stats, Darkmoon Fair buff which increases damage by 10%, and the new Sunken Temple world buff which increases your crit chance by 5%, boosts spell damage by 65 and increases all stats by 8%. So for melee DPS, these are the party-wide buffs supplied by other players in the raid that you want to obtain. Please note I will not be including typical class buffs such as Blessings, Mark of the Wild and so on. So we're going to be aiming to get Wild Strikes or Wind Fury. This is pretty much mandatory as most melee classes are borderline unplayable without this buff and you will lose substantial DPS without it. Battle Shout. This increases the party's melee attack power, preferably this is supplied by a Fury Warrior and will be improved Battle Shout. Leader of the Pack. The end of the talent tree point for Feral Druids which increases the party's physical crit chance by 3%. True Shot Aura. The end of the talent tree point for Marksmanship Hunters which increases melee and ranged attack power substantially. Other Shaman totems such as Strength of Earth and Grace of Air depending on the amount of Shamans in your group. For caster DPS there isn't too many party-wide buffs to worry about, but the buffs you will be aiming to get is Moonkin Form, the end of talent tree point for Balanced Druids which increases the party's spell critical chance by 3%, and Power Infusion. This increases spell damage and healing done by 20% for 15 seconds on the target and comes from Discipline Priests. This is not a party-wide buff but an active cooldown, so count yourself lucky if you're the guy in the raid who gets this. Moving on to the debuffs you want your raid to supply that will directly increase your DPS include armor reduction from warriors, rogues and preferably priests with homunculi, Curse of Recklessness, elements and shadow from warlocks or shadow priests with Eye of the Void, Fairy Fire from druids for even more armor reduction, Mangle for 30% increased bleed damage, Gift of Arthas, a tank consumable that debuffs the boss to increase physical damage by 8, Dream State from Druids or Storm Strike from Enhancement Shamans for 20% increased nature damage, Shadow Weaving from a Shadow Priest for increased shadow damage taken, Winter's Chill for 10% frost crit chance and improved Scorch for 15% increased fire damage from mages. There are other debuffs that can be applied from items or item sets within Sunken Temple such as the epic offhand fist weapon that has a proc to increase damage taken by holy and nature by 8%, which is huge. However, I haven't listed these here as it's technically out of your control if the items drop or not. So with all the buffs and debuffs covered and out the way, let's get into the tricks for each boss individually. Starting with Atal'alarion. There isn't much to say about this guy, you ideally want to kill him before he finishes his cast of Demolishing Smash. If your raid doesn't quite have the DPS to take him down before this, you can use a limited invulnerability potion or use your class kit such as Bubble from Paladin, Blink as a Mage, or if you're confident enough, Vanish as a Rogue to stop the pushback. Moving on to Festering Rotslime. Everyone should be using a free action potion as this makes you immune to the gunk ability, meaning you won't have to be dispelled, increasing the overall uptime on the raid without using GCDs on dispel. As a melee DPS, you want to make sure you have water breathing up just in case you are sucked inside the boss. I would probably recommend trying to avoid this and instead of run with the boss and DPS, as sometimes when you're inside the boss you can spin around and face the wrong way. Not only this, but you could lose some uptime when you get thrown out of the boss if your class has no gap closers. As a caster, you want to be smart with your casts and only hard cast when you have time. Make sure you always use instant cast spells while gaining distance and running, and remember you can always use a greater nature protection potion 2 minutes before the boss pull if you're worried about taking too much nature damage. Atal'ai Defenders. Overall this fight is quite annoying, but you need to make sure that each new boss you attack you put up your important debuffs, even if this feels bad and the fights are short. As a melee DPS, when you attack Mijan, you should not stop attacking through thorns, but if your raid is struggling to heal you through it, a shaman or a priest can dispel thorns from the boss. As for Loro, again for melee, you want to either kill him quick enough where he doesn't get his disarm cast off, or quickly dip out of range to avoid being disarmed. Paladins can stay in and just bubble this off. As for Dreamscythe and Weaver, the fight will always start with Dreamscythe until 80%, which starts phase 2 where you'll fight Weaver until 60%, and finally into phase 3 where you'll fight them both together. At this point you should keep focusing Weaver, as it will be the boss that has all the debuffs already on it. The dragons should be tanked together, as they share a health pool and any cleave would essentially be double effective. Other than that, the name of the game is uptime. If you really want to have high uptime, especially as a melee DPS, you'll want to bring snowballs. What this will do is when you self-cast a snowball using this macro, you will stop the knockback mid-air. During phase 1 and phase 2, you can immediately use the snowball after the breath, but on phase 3 when attacking Weaver, you want to be attacking the boss on the same side as where Dreamscythe is. The reason for this is the first breath will always be Dreamscythe's, so you'll be knocked back to the other side of Weaver, and then you can snowball Weaver's knockback for the most efficient uptime. Quick shout out to Simonizer for basically uploading a video explaining how this works, and that's where I got this trick from. So for Jammal'an Ogom, this fight is a bit unique, as it changes each week. During the first phase of the fight, there will be a curse that goes out. This needs to be decursed ASAP, as it reduces your damage output by 50%. You have two options at this point. If you're a class that can freely get out of stuns, such as Paladin with Bubble, Blink from Mage and so on, you could opt to use a Resto Pot here if your decurses are pretty slow. The reason why these are fine to use a Resto Pot is because if it's the week where you fight Ogom in phase 2, he does an AoE Hammer of Justice, which you'd want to use a free action potion for, but if you are a class that can negate stuns, then it doesn't matter. But ideally, you'll want to be getting Jammal, because all you'll have to worry about is if you're a melee DPS, quickly dip out of range of the fear when he casts it. Other than that, you'll want to have your priests and shamans offensively dispel the power ward shield, as it absorbs a ton of damage, and kill times do typically matter if you want to improve your DPS. Moving on to Morphaz and Hazzas. All casters want to enter the room and head towards the right hand side, which is where Hazzas will spawn in phase 2. This is so there's zero movement downtime between phases. During the first phase, fire elementals will spawn, and you want to make sure none of these die and everyone gets sent down into the realm where Hazzas is. Once everyone is down, this is technically phase 2 and the boss will take increased damage. This is where you'll burn all of your cooldowns and try and get him down as quick as possible for those fast kill times. Warriors, if you like big numbers, this is the boss you want to use Recklessness. The second to last boss, Shade of Eranikus. For melee, you always want to be on the side of the dragon, as dragons always have the typical characteristics of having cleave, a breath, and a tail swipe. For casters, you'll want to have at least 3 casters out in range to bait the deep slumber clouds, while the rest of the casters can opt to stand with the melee. If you get lethargic poison, this needs to be dispelled immediately, as it destroys your hit chance and you'll burn through your mana so fast. This is such an enormous DPS loss that I wouldn't risk waiting for a dispel, and instead would use an elixir of poison resistance to clear it instantly. The boss will also cast Bellowing Roar that can be interrupted and absolutely should be interrupted at all costs. In terms of DPS on your logs, only Shade of Eranikus and the 2 big adds called Lumber and Dreamwalkers will count. All the other adds won't count towards your pass, but I would say if your raid is struggling to still get this boss down, focus at least on the adds that cast Acid Rain, because they can be a bit overwhelming. Lastly, we have Avatar of Hakkar. Sadly, this boss is a little bit RNG due to the nature of the fight, but there are a few things you can do to increase your DPS. Firstly, the adds at the start count, so you'll want to AoE if you can, and still deal as much damage to these mobs as possible. I wouldn't worry too much about putting up debuffs as they die too fast. So moving on to phase 2, if a melee doesn't move out with the spirit chains and you all end up getting cursed, you either need to get this decursed immediately or use a resto pot, as it reduces your attack and casting speed by 50%, which is pretty nasty. Moving on to the last phase with Avatar of Hakkar himself, you just want to hope that RNGesus blesses you and you don't get either mind controlled or get too many bloods specifically as a melee, because you'll lose a lot of uptime. If you have any way to clear these debuffs, you should do immediately, such as using Divine Shield. But realistically, I wouldn't worry too much about this boss in terms of improving your DPS, because it really is all about RNG. So that's about all the buffs, debuffs and tricks covered for each boss specifically. I didn't go over every boss mechanic because this isn't a boss guide, but rather just some information on buffs and debuffs if your raid is lacking them, or some tricks on bosses specifically to push your DPS. Hopefully you have learned something new from these tricks, or important things to watch out for on bosses to be able to give you as much uptime and damage as possible. Let me know down below if I've missed anything, or you have any tips and tricks yourself that I've not mentioned in this video, or if any of this is new to you, and also let me know how you get on in your raids as well yourself.